The gavel came down before I even found my seat. I'd been standing at the entrance of the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council for less than 40 seconds when the session was called to order. The chamber was enormous, a circular hall carved from a mineral that glowed faintly blue. At the edges, with 9 elevated platforms arranged in a perfect arc, each occupied by a delegate from one of the 9 founding species of the Council. There was no human platform. There had never been a human platform. I was given a small observer's chair near the base level between a potted alien shrub and a translation terminal that smelled like hot copper. My name is Kale Vasquez. I am 34 years old. I grew up in New Mexico, studied xenolinguistics at the University of Edinburgh, spent 6 years in the United Nations Interstellar Liaison Office, and 3 weeks ago I was handed a badge, a date pad, and a one-way transit pass to the Council station above the Kalahari Nebula. I was told I was Earth's appointed observer. I was not told what that meant until the session began, and I realized the meeting was entirely about us. The assessment file for planet Earth was the last item on the agenda. I remember watching the previous 8 civilizations receive their evaluation and thinking that most of them looked nervous. A species called the Falari, who resembled tall silver-gray cranes, were praised for their expansion into 4 new star systems. The Dramathi, crab-like creatures with iridescent shells, were commended for a new bioweapon treaty they had signed. Each evaluation took roughly 12 minutes. When Earth's file finally appeared on the main display, a rotating blue sphere that looked painfully small against the scale of the projection wall, the chamber changed tone. There was no fanfare. The Council's assessment system, an artificial intelligence called the arbitration engine, simply began reading. The report was clinical. Earth's military capability was rated at a level 2 out of 12 on the galactic scale. Our fastest ships could reach only a fraction of the distances most Council species considered standard. We had no psionic capacity on record. Our average lifespan was described as critically short. Our biological resilience ranked below average. Our political unity index was the lowest of any species ever presented before the Council, with hundreds of separate governments, thousands of languages, and a recorded history dense with internal conflict. The engine noted that Earth had in the past 3 centuries alone come close to ending its own civilization on multiple occasions through environmental collapse, resource depletion, and the development of weapons capable of ending all complex life on the planet's surface. The chamber was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something uncomfortable is being confirmed. The senior delegate from the Krilquochen species, a broad stone gray being named Vorthox, whose people had founded the Council 7,000 years ago, raised a long 4-fingered hand when the engine finished reading. He did not look at me. He addressed the chamber the way a professor addresses a room when the exam results are being handed back. The assessment is consistent with prior projections, Vorthox said. His translator rendered his voice into flat, even English in my earpiece. The species designated as human shows no measurable advancement toward any of the 12 Council vitality metrics. They remain a fractured, short-lived, low-capacity civilization with a documented pattern of self-destructive Behavior. I move that Earth be reclassified under Category 7, Protected Primitive. Effective immediately, pending integration into the custodial framework. Category 7 meant Earth would lose its status as an independent civilization. It meant the Council would appoint a custodial species to oversee human affairs. It meant we would no longer govern ourselves. I raised my hand. I did not have a platform. I did not have a podium. I raised my hand from my observer's chair, the way you raise it in a meeting when the people running it have not actually given you the floor. Vorthox looked at me for the first time. Something moved behind his flat, dark eyes. It was not hostility. It was closer to mild surprise, the way you look at something small that moves unexpectedly. Observers may not address the chamber during assessment proceedings, he said. I understand, I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. But I believe Section 14 of the Council Charter allows the observed civilization to file a formal rebuttal within 72 galactic hours of a classification motion. I would like to invoke that right. Silence. One of the other delegates, a thin, pale being from a species called the Velhari, who I would later learn had been watching humans quietly for decades, leaned forward slightly. A junior analyst 2 seats down from Vorthox typed something quickly into her terminal. Her name, I would learn later, was Sareth. She was young by Krill quote Shan standards, barely 200 years old. And she was the only one in that chamber who seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Vorthox spoke after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate. Section 14 is noted. The observed species has 72 galactic hours to submit a formal rebuttal. The motion is temporarily suspended pending that submission. He glanced at me once more. We expect standard format, military readiness projections, resource capability assessments, technological development timelines. I understand what you expect, I said. I picked up my data pad, stood, and walked out of the grand chamber. The council station's outer corridor stretched out before me in both directions, lit by strips of amber light. Along the floor, through a wide observation window to my left, the Kelhari Nebula spread across the void in ribbons of red and violet, enormous and indifferent. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I opened the long-range comms channel on my data pad, set it to priority relay, and connected to Earth. The signal took 11 seconds to reach home. Then I heard the faint static of a live line, and behind it the sound of voices, people in the relay center and Geneva, who had been waiting for exactly this call. They filed a motion, I said. Category 7, they want to take our independence. I have 72 hours to file a rebuttal. I paused. They want military readiness reports. They want numbers. They want us to prove you're strong by their definition. I looked back through the observation window at the nebula. Don't send them what they asked for. Send them something they have never seen before. Send them everything. The line was quiet for 3 seconds. Then the relay coordinator, a woman named Claire Doyle, who had been managing interstellar communications for 11 years and who never raised her voice, said simply, understood. I ended the call and looked at the nebula for a while longer. The galaxy was 4.5 billion years old. The Krill quote Shan had been traveling among the stars for 7,000 years, and in 72 hours they were going to find out what it meant to make a decision about a species without properly understanding what that species was made of. I went back to my room, sat on the narrow bed and waited. I was not afraid. I was something harder to name than afraid. I was certain. 6 hours after my call to Earth, the first data package arrived. I was sitting at the small terminal in my observer's quarters when the transfer notification appeared on my screen. The file size made me blink. It was not a small package. It was not a summary or a highlights reel or a carefully selected diplomatic presentation. Earth had sent me an archive the size of a small planet's library, compressed, indexed, cross-referenced, and labeled in 47 languages with a single covering note from Claire Doyle that read, "You said everything, so we sent everything." I spent 2 hours reviewing the index alone. There were 4.3 million individual entries: art, music, literature, scientific papers, engineering, schematics, medical discoveries, philosophical texts, historical records, legal documents, speeches, letters, maps, architectural designs, mathematical proofs, agricultural innovations, the diary of a 14-year-old girl from Poland who hid in an attic during a war and kept writing about the world she intended to live in when it was over. A recording of a blind musician from Georgia who rewrote the sound of an entire century. A hand-drawn set of anatomical sketches made in secret by a painter in Renaissance Italy who was not allowed to study the human body but studied it anyway because he needed to understand how things worked. A letter written by a man sitting on the surface of the moon, describing what the Earth looked like. From there, every single item had a date, a name, a place, a context. I began preparing the presentation. Format not for the formal chamber session but for the Council's junior analysts, the working staff who processed incoming data before it reached the delegates. Their offices occupied a long corridor on the station's third level, a place that senior delegates rarely visited. Sarath was among them. I had looked her up in the station's public staff directory. After the session, she was a junior compliance analyst, which meant her job was to check that assessment reports followed the correct procedural format. It was a technical role. She had never, according to her file, been involved in a classification decision before. I sent her a formal request for a data review meeting. And GT snorts. And GT protocol required that rebuttal evidence be reviewed by at least one council analyst before it could be submitted. The request was routine. She accepted within 20 minutes. When I arrived at the analyst court of the next morning, Sarath was waiting outside her office door. Up close, she was smaller than she had appeared in the chamber. Her people were broad rather than tall, with dense gray-blue skin and eyes set wide apart, dark as polished coal. She wore a junior analyst insignia on her collar, a small silver ring. She looked at the volume of data I was carrying on my portable drive with an expression I could not immediately read. "This is your rebuttal submission?" she asked. "Part of it," I said. We went inside. Her office was neat and precise, the way offices look when the person using them takes their work seriously. She cleared space on the review table, connected my drive, and waited. I did not start with the obvious things. I did not start with scientific achievements or engineering feats. I started with the archive entry numbered 1 in my own custom index, a painting made in a cave in what is now southwestern France approximately 17,000 years ago. A human hand pressed flat against a stone wall with pigment blown around the fingers to leave a negative image, a silhouette of a hand that had reached out and said in the only language available, I was here. Sarith looked at it for a long time. Who made this? She asked. We don't know, I said. We never found out. No name, no record, just the hand. Why is it in a rebuttal submission? Because whoever made it had no pen, no paper, no light except fire, and they still found a way to leave something behind. I scrolled forward. That instinct, the need to mark existence, to make something, to say I was here, that is the thread that runs through every single item in this archive. I took her through 200 entries over the next 3 hours, not a lecture, a conversation. I snorts, pulled items at random, let her stop me, answered her questions, asked her some back. She was precise and careful in how she framed things, a quality I respected. She did not perform enthusiasm or discomfort. She simply engaged, an engagement in a being evaluating something unfamiliar was the best possible sign. At entry 87, a recording of a symphony written by a composer who had been deaf for the last decade of his life. She asked me to pause the playback. He could not hear this, she said. It was not a question. No. Then how did he write it? He heard it in his mind. He had spent so many years learning music that he could compose without sound. He heard what he imagined, not what was in the air. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, what is it called, the way your kind experiences sound that is not there? Imagination, I said, though in his case music theory, the architecture of sound without the sound itself. She made a note on her terminal. I did not ask what the note said. At entry 204, a short text by a philosopher who had lived and worked in ancient Greece. She asked me to explain the concept of legacy, why humans seem to invest so much energy in things that would outlast them when their own lives were so short. Because the shortness is the reason, I said. If you live for 800 years, there is always more time, always another century to write the book, finish the building, change the law. We have 70, 80 years if we are fortunate, so we work as if the deadline is real, because it is. Sarah set down her stylus. She looked at me the way someone looks when they are not sure whether what they are feeling is sadness or something they do not have a word for. I am 211 years old, she said. In Crawshy terms, I am a young adult. I have not yet chosen my permanent field of work. I have not yet built my residence. I have not yet completed the first phase of my formal education. She paused. You are 34. Yes. And you are already here doing this. Yes. She looked back at the display where the philosopher's text still glowed on the screen. In 200 years, she said quietly, mostly to herself, I have never thought about time the way that sentence makes me think about it. I let the silence sit for a moment, then I said, that's one of the reasons I brought the archive. We worked through another 100 entries before she stopped me again. This time at a medical case study from the 20th century detailing the development of a treatment for a disease that had ended the lives of millions of children per year worldwide. The treatment had been developed by a researcher working in a poorly equipped facility in Edinburgh with limited funding who had failed over 300 times before the breakthrough came. 300 failures, Sareth said. Yes. And he continued. I said, and yes, she continued. Did she know she would eventually succeed? No, I said, she knew only that stopping was worse than continuing. Sareth made another note. Then she leaned back slightly, which I had learned was a crotchin gesture of considered thought, and said, Delegate Vorthax will ask you to present military capability data. He has already circulated a memo to the senior analyst team indicating that any rebuttal not conforming to standard classification metrics will be procedurally ineligible. I know, I said. This archive would not be accepted under standard classification metrics. I know that too. I looked at her. Is it ineligible under your review? She considered the question carefully. The cold dark eyes moved across the hundreds of entries still queued on the screen. The charter does not specify what form a rebuttal must take, she said finally. It specifies that the rebuttal must address the grounds of the classification motion. Delegate Vorthax's motion was based on a comprehensive vitality assessment. A comprehensive response to vitality could be argued to encompass cultural, intellectual, and developmental data as well as military metrics. She paused. That is my legal reading of the text. Thank you, I said. I am not advocating for your species. She said quickly. I am applying the charter. I know, I said. That is all I asked. She looked at the archive index one more time, then she said something I was not expecting. What is grief? I looked at her. The question was direct, unguarded, the kind of question a person asks when they have been sitting with it for a while and finally decided to say it out loud. It is what you feel when you lose someone, I said, someone you love or admire or need, someone whose absence changes the shape of your days. It is the understanding that they are gone and the understanding that you will continue anyway, and the particular difficulty of holding both of those things at once. Sareth did not write anything down this time. She just held the question, turned it over quietly behind her eyes. We do not have a word for it, she said. At last, in Krashen we have a word for loss of resource, a word for biological severance, a word for the administrative state of being without a partner or parent. She paused, but not for what you described. I know, I said gently. That was one of the reasons I needed you to see the archive. She did not speak after that for a long time. We sat in the quiet of her small office while the archive glowed on the screen. Between us, 4 million entries deep, every one of them made by people who knew exactly how much time they did not have. Outside, across the station's upper levels, Delegate Vorthax was preparing a formal procedural challenge to my rebuttal submission. He had no idea what was actually coming. The council's observation arena occupied the entire southern face of the station, a wide, low-ceilinged space fitted with transparent panels that looked out directly into open space. It was used for live demonstrations, species presentations, and what the council called capacity evaluations. In simpler terms, it was where civilizations were expected to perform. I had requested use of the arena for 6 hours. Vorthax had objected on procedural grounds, Sarath had quietly filed a counter brief citing 3 separate charter provisions. The arena was approved for 4 hours, which was more than enough. The crew of the Earth vessel, a small research and liaison ship called the Meridian, crewed by 12 people from 12 different countries, had docked at the station the previous evening. I had met them briefly in the transit corridor. Their names were Owen, Priya, Sione, Annika, Callum, Lena, Dale, Freya, Hassan, Nadia, Riku, and June. Between them, they held degrees in medicine, structural engineering, linguistics, materials science, navigation, environmental systems, emergency response, xenobiology, cryptography, logistics, marine biology, and classical music. None of them had ever been to a Galactic Council station before. All 12 of them walked off that ship with the same look on their faces, calm, focused, slightly fascinated, the way professionals look when they step into a situation that is genuinely new and choose to treat it as interesting rather than frightening. I liked them immediately. The senior delegates were not required to attend the arena demonstration. 4 of them came anyway. Sarath was there. 3 other junior analysts stood along the back wall. Vorthax arrived late, took a position at the far end of the viewing gallery, and crossed his thick arms in a way that made his position on the proceedings entirely clear. I introduced the crew briefly, named their disciplines, and explained the structure of the demonstration. 3 separate exercises, no advanced preparation provided by me, no council technology assistance, only the tools and knowledge the crew had brought with them. The first exercise was medical. 3 days earlier, I had quietly asked the station's facilities coordinator if there was a current maintenance problem anywhere on the station, something real, not staged. There was. A Valhari technician named Oru had suffered a serious pressure-related injury in a maintenance shaft 2 days before and was recovering in the station's medical bay. The council's own medical team had stabilized him but lacked the specific microsurgical equipment to complete the secondary repair to a small but important blood vessel near his shoulder joint. They had been waiting on a parts delivery from Valhari space. I had asked Oru if he would consent to be treated by our medical team. He had said yes without hesitation, which I found quietly moving. Owen and Priya, our surgeon and our biomedical engineer, spent 40 minutes in the medical bay with Oru and a complete inventory of what was available on the station. They found no compatible surgical tools. They improvised 3 instruments from station maintenance components, a piece of flexible conduit tubing, and a micro-calibration tool from the Meridian's own repair kit. Then they performed the repair. The procedure took 1 hour and 11 minutes. When they came out, Priya was carrying the improvised instruments in a sterile tray, and Owen was wiping his hands on a cloth with the easy, satisfied manner of someone who had simply done what they came to do. Oru was sitting up an hour later and asked the station's kitchen staff for something warm to drink. The 4 senior delegates in the gallery were very quiet. For the second exercise, I had asked Callum, our structural engineer, to address a problem the station had been quietly managing for 6 months. The station's primary coolant manifold on level 4 was operating with a slow efficiency loss caused by a micro Fracture in a junction coupling. The council's engineering team had identified it but could not repair it without the specific replacement parts, which were on order. In the meantime, the station's climate systems on levels 4 through 6 ran 3 degrees warmer than optimal, which was uncomfortable but not dangerous. The Crawchan engineering team had submitted 7 reports on the issue. None of the reports proposed a workaround. Callum read the 7 reports in 45 minutes, toward the manifold for 20 minutes, and then spent 3 hours implementing a rerouted pressure distribution system using components already present in the station's spare parts inventory. He did not have the schematic for the station's original engineering design. He worked from first principles, asked Lena, our material scientist, 2 questions about the thermal properties of the coupling material, and solved the problem the way engineers solve problems when they do not have the right tools, by understanding the system well enough to find a different path through it. When the temperature on level 5 dropped to the correct setting, one of the cryosat junior analysts looked up from his terminal and then looked at Callum as though he was not entirely sure what he was seeing. The third exercise was the one I had been most curious about myself. June was our linguist. She was 29 years old, originally from Bristol, and she had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who spend a lot of time listening. I had briefed her on the specific challenge the night before. The council's archive contained a collection of recordings in a language called Vethkai, spoken by a species that had gone extinct approximately 4,000 years ago. The Vethkai had made contact with the early council and left behind a collection of audio recordings and carved text fragments before their civilization ended. The recordings had never been fully decoded. They were used as a standard benchmark test in council xenolinguistic training programs. Most trained council linguists reached approximately 40% comprehension after 6 months of dedicated study. I gave June the full archive of Vethka material. I gave her 18 hours. She stood at the arena's main display, pulled up the recordings and the carved fragments side by side, and began working through them in front of the gallery. Not silently, she narrated her process, speaking quietly into her translation headset, noting patterns aloud, backtracking when something did not fit, cross-referencing the carved text against the audio in a way that reminded me of watching someone solve a puzzle that they found genuinely enjoyable. After 1 hour and 43 minutes, she turned to the gallery and said she had reached approximately 62% comprehension and could provide a working translation of the oldest complete Vethkai recording. She played it, then she translated it, sentence by sentence, into English. And Sarath, standing at the back of the room, translated it simultaneously into the council's common language for the delegates. It was a record of a harvest season, a farmer describing the smell of rain on dry soil, the sound of the work, the names of the people working beside him. 4,000 years old, spoken by a species that no longer existed, and entirely, unmistakably about the same things all farmers in all places have always thought about: the work, the weather, and the people standing next to you. The room was quiet for a while after that. Then Vorthax spoke. His voice came from the far end of the gallery, flat and deliberate. These are impressive technical exercises, he said, I do not dispute the competence demonstrated. However, the classification motion before this council is not based on competence in narrow circumstances. It is based on the consistent pattern of self-destruction your species has exhibited across your recorded history. He gestured at the display with one broad hand. You have presented art and music and a demonstration of field improvisation. You have not addressed the fact that your species has started over 200 large-scale organized conflicts in the last 3 centuries alone. You have not addressed the weapons your governments built that were capable of ending all complex life on your planet. You have not addressed the environmental collapse events your industrial civilization triggered. A species that nearly ends itself multiple times does not demonstrate vitality. It demonstrates a persistent danger to its neighbors. The gallery was very still. I had been waiting for this moment. I had thought about how to answer it for 2 days. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform indignation. I stood in the center of the arena floor and answered him the way you answer an argument that is partly correct and therefore more difficult to address than one that is entirely wrong. You are right, I said. That surprised him. I could see it. Everything you listed happened, I said. The conflicts, the weapons, the environmental damage, it is all in the record. We did not ask Earth to remove those items from the archive. We sent everything, including the worst of it, because the worst of it is part of the answer, not a contradiction of it. I paused. Every atrocity in that record was eventually condemned by us. Every weapon built for mass destruction was eventually challenged, limited, or dismantled by us. The environmental collapse events triggered the largest coordinated scientific and policy effort in human history organized by us. No external force civilized humanity. No council intervention corrected our direction. We did it ourselves, imperfectly, slowly, painfully, and without stopping. I looked at him directly. You are evaluating us on the basis of our worst moments and concluding we cannot be trusted with our own future. But our worst moments are precisely the reason you should trust us with it. Because we looked at those moments, judged them, and changed course, not once, over and over. That is not a sign of danger. That is the definition of a civilization that is still growing. The silence in the arena lasted long enough to become something more than silence. Sareth at the back of the room had stopped writing. Vorthak said nothing for 7 seconds. Then he said, the formal session will reconvene tomorrow. The council will deliberate. He left the gallery without another word. One of the other senior delegates, the Velhari representative, a pale, quiet being named Ethos, who had said almost nothing during the entire assessment period, stopped beside me as the gallery cleared. She looked at me for a moment with her wide, unreadable eyes and then said, very softly, he is not wrong to be cautious, but he is wrong about what he is being cautious of. She moved on before I could ask what she meant. I stood in the empty arena for a while, looking out through the transparent panels at the open stars. Owen came and stood beside me. He did not say anything, neither did I. We just stood there the way people stand when something large has just moved through a room and the air is still settling. Outside, the stars were the same as they had always been, But something in the station felt different. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not with noise or declaration, but in the quiet way that real things shift when the right words finally land in the right place. Tomorrow the council would deliberate. I was ready. The formal session was called for the following morning, and I arrived at the Grand Chamber 20 minutes early. I had not slept much, not from worry. Something closer to alertness. The kind of wakefulness that comes when the situation you are in has reached the point where all the preparation is done, and what remains is simply to be present for whatever comes next. I had reviewed my notes once, set them aside, and spent the last hour before the session watching the nebula from my quarters window. It looked the same as it always did. That was reassuring. When I entered the chamber, the analyst stations were already occupied. Sarath was at her terminal in the second row, focused on her screen. She did not look up, but as I passed, she placed 2 fingers briefly on the edge of her desk, a gesture I did not recognize but which felt from its quietness like acknowledgement. I took my observer's chair between the copper-smelling translator and the alien shrub and waited. The 9 delegates filed in. Vorthax was the last to arrive. He moved to his platform with the deliberate pace of someone who is performing composure rather than feeling it, which was interesting because in all the time I had watched him, he had never needed to perform it before. Something had changed in how he carried himself, and the change was small enough that most people would have missed it. I did not miss it. The session chair, a rotating position, held that month by the Falori delegate, a silver-gray figure named Thessaly, called the chamber to order and announced that the deliberation on Earth's classification would proceed. Standard protocol allowed each delegate to speak once before the vote. 6 delegates spoke, 3 declined. The first 3 speakers were broadly in favor of the original motion, category 7, protected primitive. Their arguments were measured and consistent. Earth's internal instability, its low technological development relative to the galactic average, its lack of unified governance. They were not hostile arguments. They were the arguments of beings who genuinely believed they were applying a reasonable standard. The next 2 speakers were opposed. Ethos of the Velhari spoke carefully and at some length about the distinction between a civilization that is dangerous and a civilization that is developing, arguing that Earth's record showed a consistent long-term trajectory of self-correction, that the current assessment metrics were not designed to capture a delegate from a small, rarely heard species called the Rhymoth, quiet beings who resembled deep-sea creatures and who had been members of the council for only 300 years, said simply that any species capable of producing the archive Earth had submitted deserved the opportunity to produce more of it. Then Vorthax spoke. I had expected him to reinforce his original motion. Instead, he did something that made the chamber slightly uncomfortable, which told me more about what was happening behind the scenes than anything else could have. He recalibrated. He did not withdraw the motion, but he introduced a procedural amendment, a request that the vote be delayed by 30 galactic days pending what he described as further comprehensive review of the submitted materials. He cited the volume of the archive, the unusual format of the rebuttal, and the Need for appropriate institutional assessment of unprecedented submission. Types. It was, on the surface, a reasonable request. Procedurally, it was entirely valid, but it was also a retreat. Vortex did not request delays. In the 7 years of recorded sessions available in the station's public archive, he had never once requested a delay on a motion he himself had introduced. He was a being who moved forward, who pressed advantages, who treated hesitation as a weakness. The request told me that something had shifted in his calculations, that the ground he had been standing on had developed a crack he had not anticipated. I submitted a formal objection to the delay on the grounds that the charter's 72-hour rebuttal window was specifically designed to prevent indefinite procedural postponement of classification decisions. Sareth from her terminal flagged the same charter provision. Thessaly, the session chair, reviewed both submissions in real time and ruled that the vote would proceed. Vortex did not react visibly. He was too experienced for visible reactions. But he pressed his broad fingers flat on the surface of his platform in a way had not seen him do before, and the gesture stayed with me. The vote was taken. 4 delegates voted against the Category 7 classification. 3 voted for it. 2 abstained pending a separate investigation that Ethos had quietly filed that morning, an investigation I had not known about until the session chair announced it. The investigation was into the Croshen's pre-filed resource assessment of Earth's solar system, a survey conducted 6 months before the vitality assessment had even been scheduled, mapping the rare mineral deposits in Earth's asteroid belt, the helium-3 concentration on the lunar surface, and the strategic positioning of Earth's system relative to a contested trade corridor that the Croshen had been trying to control for 40 years. I had sent that survey to Ethos 2 days ago. I had found it in the public commercial filing records, legally visible, technically obscure, the kind of document buried in bureaucratic depth specifically because someone hoped it would never surface. I had not told anyone I was sending it. Not Sareth, not the crew, not Claire Doyle in Geneva. I had simply found it, read it, understood what it meant, and sent it to the one delegate who had spoken to me quietly in the arena with the careful honesty of someone who already suspected the truth and needed only the evidence to act on it. The session chair declared Earth's classification motion suspended pending the investigation's completion. Earth retained its independent status. The hearing was closed. That was the moment Vorthos looked at me. Not the look from the first day, not the mild surprise at something small moving unexpectedly. This was different. This was the look of a very experienced being recalculating a situation it had fundamentally misread. It was not anger. It was something more complex than anger. I met his gaze and held it. Then the session ended and the delegates began to file out, and I sat in my observer's chair and exhaled for the first time in what felt like several hours. Sareth appeared at my side before the chamber had fully cleared. She was holding her data pad against her chest and looking at me with an expression that took me a moment to read. "You found the resource survey," she said. "Yes." "When?" "3 days ago." "You did not tell me." "No," I said, "because you are a council analyst. If I had told you, you would have been obligated to report it immediately, and Vorthax would have had time to challenge the filing or bury it deeper. By the time it reached formal investigation, it would have been qualified into irrelevance. Ethos needed to file it herself, independently, for it to carry full investigative weight. Sareth was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is a precise understanding of our procedural system for someone who has been on the station for less than 2 weeks. I read the charter," I said, "all of it on the transit ship on the way here." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said something in Croshen that my translator rendered as a rough approximation of the concept. "You came here prepared to be underestimated." I stood and picked up my data pad. "I came here prepared," I said. Underestimation was already in place. When I arrived, I started toward the chamber exit. Behind me, I heard Sareth say quietly, not to me, just to the empty air of the chamber as the last delegates left, "Remarkable." I did not turn around. Outside in the amberlit corridor, I opened a channel to the Meridian. Owen answered. "How did it go?" he asked. "The motion is suspended. The corruption investigation is open. We keep our independence." There was a brief silence on the line. Then I heard, distantly behind Owen's voice, someone else on the ship saying something, and then the sound of people reacting, not loudly, not with celebration, just with the specific quiet release of a breath held too long. "Claire is going to want a full debrief," Owen said. "I know, tell her I will transmit everything within the hour." I paused. "How is Oru moving his shoulder this morning?" Asked Priya if she would send him the schematic for the improvised instrument, so his people could manufacture a proper version. I smiled. "Tell Priya yes." I ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. The investigation into Vorthax's resource survey would take time. It would be contested. The Croshen had significant influence in council procedures, and influence of that kind did not dissolve because of a single filing. There would be more sessions, more arguments, more careful navigation through a system designed by beings who had been building it for thousands of years and who had never seriously expected a species like ours to learn it well enough to use it. But the motion was suspended. Earth was independent, and somewhere in the Council's records, an investigation had been opened that would not be easy to close. I started walking back toward my quarters. Halfway down the corridor, I passed the observation window with the view of the Kelhari Nebula, the same view I had stood at after the first session when everything had seemed much less certain. I stopped and looked at it again. It still looked enormous. It still looked indifferent. But something in how I looked at it had changed. Not the nebula me. I had come here as an observer. I was leaving as something the charter did not have a precise category for. A being from a species the council had assessed as weak, who had walked into the oldest political institution in the known galaxy with a hard drive full of human history and an understanding of its own rules, and had used both to prevent something that should never have been attempted in the first place. That felt like a thing worth noting. I noted it and kept walking. The investigation lasted 19 days. I spent most of them on the station, waiting, reviewing documents, and talking with Sareth. We had moved past the formal analyst-observer dynamic. By the end of the first week, she would come to my quarters in the evenings. After her shift, sit in the second chair by the terminal and ask questions, sometimes about the archive, sometimes about specific humans she had read about in the records, sometimes about things that had no direct connection to the case at all. She asked me once what rain felt like. I told her it depended on the rain. She asked me to explain what I meant by that, and I spent an hour describing the difference between the cold spring rain that came sideways off the North Sea and the warm, heavy summer rain in New Mexico that smelled like wet earth and made the desert bloom. She listened carefully and made no notes. I think she was simply keeping it. The formal session reconvening Earth's classification status was scheduled for the 19th day, 3 hours after the investigation committee submitted its final report. Report was comprehensive. It documented that the Crochen's Commercial Surveying Division had filed detailed resource assessments of Earth's solar system on 4 separate occasions over the past decade, each time to coincide with internal council discussions about expanding the vitality assessment schedule to include Earth. It documented that the commercial filings had been routed through 3 separate subsidiary entities to obscure the connection to the Crochen Government Strategic Planning Division, and it documented that 2 members of Vortex's advisory staff had participated in drafting the Category 7 motion language using terminology specifically borrowed from historical council rulings on resource-contested systems, a language designed to ease the administrative transition to custodial status, which in practice meant structured access to the system's resources by the appointed custodial species. It was not a subtle report. The investigation committee, chaired by Ethos, had written it with the precision of people who wanted the findings to be unambiguous. Vortex was formally censured and removed from the current session. It was not the end of his political career. He was too senior, too established, too embedded in Crochen institutional life for a single censure to end him. But it was a permanent mark on a record that had until this session been entirely clean. That mattered to him. I knew it mattered from the way he had pressed his hands flat on his platform during the vote, the way a being presses down on something when it is slipping. Thessaly, still chairing the session, opened the reconvened hearing with a brief statement acknowledging the investigation's findings and confirming that the Category 7 motion had been invalidated due to procedural corruption. Earth status required a fresh determination. Then she did something I had not expected. She asked me to address the chamber directly, not as an observer filing a rebuttal, not as a procedural respondent. She used the formal language of the charters, Section 7, which allowed the session chair to invite a non-member civilization to speak on its own behalf before a formal status determination. It was a provision that had been used only twice in the Council's recorded history. Thessaly, a silver-gray Falari who moved with the quiet deliberateness of someone choosing each action carefully, had chosen to use it now. I stood up from my observer's chair and walked to the center of the chamber floor. The 9 platforms looked down at me. 7 were occupied. Vortex's seat and the seat of one absent delegate were empty. 7 sets of eyes watched me Behind the delegates, the analyst rose. We're full. Sareth sat in her usual place, hands folded on the desk, watching with the complete concentrated attention she brought to things she considered important. I had not prepared a formal speech. I had thought about what I wanted to say. The way you think about something you know you will need to say when the moment arrives, and then I had trusted that when the moment arrived I would say it the right way. I looked up at the 7 delegates. My name is Cale Vasquez, I said. I am 34 years old, which means by council standard life expectancy tables, I'm approximately halfway through my natural lifespan. I grew up on a planet that has been inhabited by my species for roughly 300,000 years. We have had writing for about 5,000 of those years, formal science for roughly 400, and space travel for less than 100. By galactic standards, we are extraordinarily new. I paused. You assessed us as weak, I understand. Why? The metrics you used are real metrics, and on most of them we do not perform well. We are short-lived. We are fractured. We are still working through the consequences of decisions made generations before the ones currently alive were born. We have been at various points in our history our own worst problem. I looked at Ethos, then at Thessaly, then at the Rymeth delegate, who was watching me with an unreadable deep water stillness. But I want to tell you what those metrics do not capture, because I think it matters more than anything else I could say here today. I took a breath. There is a concept in human philosophy called the long arc. It refers to the idea that history does not move in straight lines. It moves in arcs, and those arcs, if you have the patience to follow them far enough, tend to bend towards something better than where they started. We have a name for it because we need a name for it, because there have been many points in our history where the arc seemed to be bending the wrong way, where the weight of our failures threatened to pull us permanently off course, and someone, usually someone ordinary, usually someone without power, often someone who would not live to see the outcome, pushed back. I thought of the hand on the cave wall. And GT snorts. And GT, the deaf composer at his desk hearing a symphony in the silence, the researcher who failed 300 times and continued because stopping was worse. We are not the strongest species in this galaxy, I said. We are not the oldest, the most advanced, or the most unified. We are a young species from a small planet, still in the early chapters of whatever it is we are going to become. And we came here today not to prove that we are powerful. We came here to ask for the simple right to continue. The chamber was very quiet. Not because we deserve special consideration, not because our history is clean, it is not, and we know it, but because a civilization that has made the mistakes we have made and faced them and changed and faced them again and changed again without ever fully stopping is a civilization that is still becoming something, and something that is still becoming should not be frozen in place before it finishes. I stood still for a moment. The archive we submitted contains 4.3 million items. Every one of them was made by a person who knew they were going to die. Every one of them was made. Anyway, that is not weakness. That is what it looks like when a species refuses to let its own limitations be the final word about what it is capable of. I let the last sentence settle. Earth does not ask to be judged on what We ask only to be measured by what we are still becoming. I walked back to my observer's chair and sat down. The vote was taken 40 minutes later. Following brief consultation among the delegates, the result was 5 in favor of reclassification, 0 against 2 abstentions. Earth was reclassified as provisional sovereign, a status that granted full self-governance rights, formal council, observer membership with eligibility to apply for full membership within 50 galactic years, and access to basic inter-council trade frameworks. It was the fastest reclassification from unclassified to provisional sovereign council history. Thessaly noted this in the formal record, without additional comment, in the way someone notes something they consider worth noting. The session closed. The chamber began to empty. I sat in my observer's chair for a while. I was not trying to feel the weight of the moment. That is a thing people say they do, and I have always suspected is mostly performed. What I actually felt was tired in the way that is entirely comfortable. The tiredness that follows a task completed rather than one avoided. Owen and the crew were waiting outside the chamber when I came out. None of them said anything dramatic. Callum shook my hand. Lana smiled. Deo, who had been the quietest of the 12 during the entire week, and who had an extraordinary stillness about him that I had come to deeply respect, simply nodded, and that nod communicated everything it needed to. June handed me a small folded piece of paper. I looked at her. Old habits, she said. Open it later. I put it in my pocket. Sarif found me in the corridor near the observation window, the same window, the same view of the Kalahari Nebula that I had stood at the beginning of all of this. She stopped a comfortable distance away and looked out at the nebula with me for a moment before she spoke. The archive will be formally entered into the galactic record, she said. I submitted the paperwork this morning. It will be indexed under cultural heritage, scientific history, and she paused, choosing her words carefully. Developmental documentation. The first time a species' cultural output has been given full record weight, equivalent to military and technological data. Thank you, I said. It was the correct procedural action. She said, but she said it the way people say something correct when they also mean something more than correct. We stood looking at the nebula for a while. When you go home, she said at last, what will you tell them? I thought about it. About the cave painting and the deaf composer and the researcher who failed 300 times. About Oru sitting up and asking for something warm to drink. About June's folded piece of paper in my pocket. About the arc and how it bends. I will tell them it worked, I said, and that the work is not finished. She nodded slowly. Your species, she said with a careful thoughtfulness that I had come to understand was her equivalent of strong feeling, is going to be very difficult to manage. I laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere real. Yes, I said, we really are. I looked out at the nebula one final time. The ribbons of red and violet, enormous and indifferent, the same as they had always been, the same as they would be long after every species in that station was gone. Then I took June's folded paper from my pocket and opened it. It was a drawing, small, simple, made in the margins of a station data pad. Hand palm flat, fingers spread in the Style of a cave wall in southwestern France, 17,000 years old. Beneath it in June, small, precise. Handwriting, 2 words. We were here. I folded it carefully and put it back in my pocket. Then I walked toward the docking bay, toward the ship, toward home.